Some stories don't begin with thunder or fireworks. They start quietly, with ink on paper, a shaking hand, and a truth that feels too heavy to say out loud. This is one of those stories, a story told in letters that were never meant to be found, and a love that spent years learning how to speak. Keanu wrote the first letter in a cheap hotel room, long after the cameras stopped rolling, and the noise of the day had faded into that heavy kind of silence only actors really know. The movie he and Sandra had just finished together was supposed to be a simple job, another project, another set. But something about her refused to stay on set when the director yelled cut. He could still hear her laugh in the hallway, still see the way she listened when crew members talked about their families, how she remembered names that everyone else forgot. She carried a softness into a world that rewarded sharp edges, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. He sat at the small wooden desk, elbows on a stack of untouched scripts, turning a hotel notepad over in his fingers. His life to the outside world looked golden, fame, money, a future paved with premieres and red carpets. But inside he carried a quiet ache he rarely shared, grief for people he'd lost, guilt for the times he hadn't been able to save anyone, not even himself. A strange, constant fear that if he let people close, they'd either leave or discover that beneath the gentle smiles and polite interviews, he was mostly just tired. Not of life, but of pretending it was always okay. He began the letter as a joke, the way he often hid the serious things. "Dear Sandra, I was going to call, but my phone is as shy as I am." He smiled to himself, then the smile slowly faded as his pen kept moving. Line by line, what started as a playful note turned into something else. He thanked her for treating the crew with kindness when everyone was exhausted. He told her he'd noticed how she stayed late to comfort a young extra who'd messed up a scene and cried in the hallway. He admitted that watching her work made him want to be braver, not just as an actor, but as a person. He didn't say, "I think I'm starting to fall for you." He didn't dare. Instead, he wrote, "You make this strange life feel a little more like home." When he finished, he stared at the pages, suddenly unsure. They felt too honest, too raw. He'd always believed that real feelings complicated everything, and Hollywood did not forgive complications. He folded the letter anyway, slid it into an envelope, and wrote her name on the front. The plan was simple: leave it at the front desk, anonymous, signed only with a small drawing in the corner, a tiny lighthouse, a private symbol. A thank you she'd never be able to trace back to him, but might still feel when she read the words. He made it as far as the elevator. Standing there, the envelope in his hand, he felt an old fear rising. What if she figured out it was him and felt uncomfortable? What if it changed the easy friendship they'd just begun to build on set? Those quiet conversations over coffee, the shared jokes between takes, the way she'd nudge his shoulder when he retreated into his head for too long. Their connection was gentle and unforced. He treasured that. He couldn't risk it. In a small moment of cowardice, though he would later call it caution to make it hurt less, he stepped out of the elevator, went back to his room, and slipped the sealed envelope into his suitcase instead. The letter traveled home with him. Weeks later, when the movie premiered and the world watched them laugh together on red carpets, that envelope was tucked in a shoebox in his closet, alongside scripts, ticket stubs, and a few old photographs he didn't show anyone. Whenever he missed her, he'd open the box, take out the folded pages, and read his own words like they belonged to someone bolder, someone who knew how to say things out loud. Then he would put the letter back, close the lid, and carry on being the version of Keanu everyone expected. The kind, quiet professional who never made a fuss, never demanded more than he was given. Sandra, meanwhile, moved through her own whirlwind. New roles, blinking camera flashes, a constant stream of interviews and expectations. She would sometimes think of him when she caught sight of a familiar city skyline they had driven past together or heard a song that played during one of their scenes. She remembered the way he listened more than he spoke, how he would step aside to let others shine, lifting them quietly instead of competing for the spotlight. She wondered if he was okay. She wondered if their paths would cross again in some unscripted way, without a director, without marks on the floor to tell them where to stand. Months turned into years, and fate, as it often does, stayed silent, until one late autumn afternoon when Keanu came home to the faint smell of dust and rain and made a decision he didn't fully understand yet. He pulled the shoebox from the top of his closet, sat cross-legged on the floor, and began reading through the letters he had written but never sent. Not just the first one, but all the others that had followed. Quiet messages to a woman he respected more than he dared to confess. Each one written after some interview of hers, some charity work she'd done, some moment where her compassion had shone through the noise. Pages filled with gratitude, with admiration, with stories of his own fears and failures that he'd never spoken aloud to anyone else. He realized, with a sudden trembling in his hands, that these weren't just notes. They were a record of who he had been becoming over the years, more honest on paper than he had ever allowed himself to be in person. And tucked between all that ink was another truth he could no longer ignore. His life had been quietly shaped by a woman who didn't even know the half of what she meant to him. As he lifted the first, yellowing envelope and traced her name written in his careful handwriting, the old question returned, sharper than ever. Was it too late to tell her? Too late to send even one of these letters and risk changing everything they thought they knew about each other? His phone buzzed on the table, an unknown number flashing on the screen, and the moment he answered, a familiar voice came through, warm, hesitant, carrying a weight he felt in his chest before he understood it in words. "Hey," Sandra said softly. "I found something today, and I think it might be yours." The room around him seemed to tilt, the shoebox still open at his feet, as he tried to make sense of what she had just said, and how she could possibly be holding anything that belonged to him. She didn't sound like the woman he'd last seen laughing on a red carpet. Her voice was slower now, edged with something fragile. Keanu pressed the phone tighter to his ear as he stood there in the half-lit room, the open shoebox at his feet, his own unsent letters staring back at him like witnesses. What did you find?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light, casual, as if his heart wasn't already pounding. There was a pause on the other end, the kind where 1,000 thoughts squeeze through a single breath. "A letter," Sandra said. "Actually more than one. They're old, and they're addressed to me, but they were hidden in the back of a storage box at the studio. No name, just this little drawing in the corner." She gave a soft, almost disbelieving laugh. "A lighthouse. I don't know why, but it felt familiar." His throat went dry. The tiny lighthouse, the symbol he'd used to sign the very first letter he never sent. He had sworn that envelope had come home with him, that he'd tucked it safely into the shoebox. For a moment he wondered if memory could play tricks that cruelly. He sat down on the edge of his bed, legs suddenly unsteady. "Are you sure it's recent?" he managed. "They're from years ago," she said. "The paper's worn at the edges, some of the ink-s faded, but the words—" Her voice trailed off, then came back softer. "They're not the kind of words you just forget you wrote or forget you received, and I'm very sure I never received them." He knew then, at least one letter had slipped through the crack between regret and hesitation. Maybe it had fallen from his bag on set, maybe some assistant, too busy to care, had shoved it into a box. Whatever the path, the result was the same. After all these years, one of his buried truths had clawed its way to the surface. A quiet dread and a strange, electric hope collided in his chest. "What does it say?" he asked, even though he could probably recite every line by heart. There was the rustle of paper, the faint scratch as she adjusted the pages. When she spoke, her voice carried a different weight. She wasn't just reading aloud. She was stepping into a version of the past she hadn't known existed. "Dear Sandra," she began, and he closed his eyes. "I was going to call, but my phone is as shy as I am. I just wanted to say thank you. This set could have turned into another machine, but somehow, because of you, it felt human. You make everyone breathe easier, like they're allowed to be more than what the camera wants from them." Her words slowed as she reached the parts he barely remembered writing but had always meant. "You probably don't realize it, but watching you be kind when no one's watching, that's the bravest thing I've seen in a long time. It makes me want to try harder, to be the kind of person who deserves to stand next to you, even when the lights are off." Sandra stopped there. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, the brightness in her voice had been replaced with something raw. "You didn't sign it, just the lighthouse. But the way it's written, the rhythm of it, Keanu, I read it 3 times before I picked up the phone. I kept thinking, this sounds like him." He swallowed, searching for air. The truth sat heavy on his tongue, pressing for release, but behind it was fear. Fear that she'd think it was creepy, that she'd feel betrayed by his silence, that whatever fragile, unspoken trust they had would crack under the weight of words written too late. Sandra, he started, then stopped. Out the window, the city pulsed in indifferent light. Inside the room, every second stretched like a challenge. "I'm not calling to accuse you," she said quietly. "I'm calling because whoever wrote this saw me in a way I didn't think anyone did back then. I was trying so hard to look strong, to look like I had it together. Reading this, it was like someone had stood behind all that and just noticed the truth anyway. And if it was you, I need to understand why you never said anything." That was what struck him hardest. Not anger, not bitterness, just a deep, honest need to understand. It was the same way she approached everything, with a kind of fierce gentleness that gave people room to be flawed. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "I was scared," he said simply. "Scared of losing what we had, scared of making it weird, scared that if I let someone see the real mess in my head, they'd walk away." He laughed once softly at himself. "So I did the dumb thing. I wrote it all down and then hid it like honesty was something dangerous instead of necessary." On the other end of the line, there was quiet. He waited, his mind racing through every possible reaction she could have. Anger, awkward laughter, a polite promise to talk later that would never really come. Instead, she said, "Why did you draw a lighthouse?" "Because I thought that's what you were," he replied before he could overthink it. "To me, back then, a light that didn't move even when everything else did. Something steady in a world where everything feels temporary." The silence that followed was different now. Softer, warmer, yet more loaded than any conversation they'd had before. He could almost see her, sitting somewhere with that letter in her hands, absorbing the weight of what he'd finally said out loud after so many years of pretending it didn't matter. "When I read this today," Sandra said slowly, "I was in a pretty dark place. I don't mean dramatic movie dark, just tired, worn down, questioning if anything I've done actually mattered. And then I find this old letter hidden in a dusty box, and there it is. Someone saying the small things counted, that I made some part of a hard world a little softer." Her voice broke just slightly. "I needed that more than you can imagine." He felt shame twist with empathy. While he'd been hoarding his feelings in a closet, she'd been fighting her own private battles with doubt. It struck him that all this time, they'd both been trying to protect each other from their vulnerability when what they really needed was to share it. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have sent it, all of them actually." "All of them?" she repeated, caught on the word. He glanced down at the shoebox, at the fan of folded envelopes like scattered chapters of a story he'd never given her. "I wrote more than one. Every few years, I guess. When I saw you in a new movie or heard about something kind you did. Times when I wanted to say, 'I'm proud of you,' but couldn't figure out how to do it without crossing some invisible line." Sandra exhaled a stunned breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "You've got to be kidding me. You have a stash of unsent letters just lying around." "Hidden," he corrected softly, "in a box, with all the other things I was too afraid to lose." "You still have them?" she asked. "Yeah, I'm looking at them right now." Another long pause. This one felt like a bridge being built plank by plank. "Keanu, can I ask you something? And I want the truth, not the polite version." "Okay." "When you wrote those letters, was it just admiration? Or was there something you didn't say because you thought it would be too much?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of old feelings spreading through the years between them. He thought of the nights he'd sat alone, pen in hand, censoring his own heart. Of the moments he'd watched her with someone else on magazine covers and convinced himself he'd missed whatever window there had been. Of the countless times he'd chosen distance over risk. He knew he was standing at the edge of a line he'd drawn himself, a line between safety and truth. Crossing it could change everything, for better or for worse. But for the first time, he felt something stronger than his fear, the understanding that silence had already cost them enough. He took a breath, steady and deliberate. "There was always more I didn't say," he admitted, "because I thought telling you might ruin the one good, simple thing we had, our friendship, our respect. So I kept it on paper and pretended that was enough." "And now," she asked gently, almost in a whisper, "is it still enough?" He opened his mouth to answer, to finally put years of hidden feeling into words, when a loud knock echoed through his apartment. 3 sharp raps that didn't sound like a delivery or a neighbor. He flinched, startled, phone still pressed to his ear. "Everything okay?" Sandra asked. The knocking came again, insistent this time, as if whoever was on the other side knew they were interrupting something important and refused to wait. Keanu stood slowly, eyes fixed on the door, his heart racing for a completely new reason. "Someone's here," he said, his voice low. "Do you need to go?" she asked, disappointment thinly veiled beneath her concern. He hesitated, torn between the conversation that had taken years to begin and the unexpected presence standing just beyond his doorstep. The knocking stopped, replaced by a shadow shifting under the crack of the door. "I don't know," he said honestly. As his fingers curled around the doorknob, phone still pressed to his ear and Sandra's breath faintly audible on the line. He felt the weight of every unsent word, every second chance he'd let slip away. This time, he told himself, he couldn't afford to choose silence. He turned the handle and pulled the door open, only to freeze, staring at the last person he ever expected to see standing there, holding something that would upend everything he thought he knew about those hidden letters. Some stories feel like they're writing themselves while you're still trying to hold the pen steady. This was one of those moments, where the air goes thin, your palms go cold, and you know without understanding why that something small is about to change everything. Keanu opened the door and found himself staring at a man he hadn't seen in years. Owen, a former assistant from one of their earliest films, stood in the hallway holding a worn, studio-stamped box against his chest. His hair was grayer, his posture more tired, but his eyes were exactly the same, earnest, apologetic, always looking like he carried an extra weight that didn't belong to him. "Owen," Keanu said, still clutching the phone to his ear. On the line, Sandra went quiet at the sound of the unfamiliar name. "Hey," Owen replied, shifting the box nervously. "Sorry to just show up. I tried calling the old number on file, but, that didn't go so well. I figured this was too important to trust to a voicemail." Keanu stepped aside, motioning him in. "Come in. I'm actually on the phone with Sandra right now." At the mention of her name, Owen blinked, then let out a short, anxious laugh. "Well, that's eerie timing." Keanu put the phone on speaker and set it gently on the small table by the door. "You're on speaker," he told Sandra. "Owen S. here. He used to work on set with us. He says he has something important." "Hi, Sandra," Owen said, his voice suddenly formal. "Not sure if you remember me. I was the kid always tripping over cables and crying in the bathroom when I thought I ruined a shot." Sandra's soft chuckle drifted through the speaker. "Of course I remember. You were the one who used to loan me your hoodie between takes because the studio was freezing." "That's me," he said, a flush of nostalgia softening his face. "Listen, I know this is weird, but I need to show you both something. I've been putting this off for a long time, and when I found this box today, I realized I didn't have the right to keep quiet anymore." He set the box down on the coffee table. The old cardboard flaps were frayed, the studio logo almost rubbed off. A strip of yellowing tape clung weakly to the side, like it had been sealed in another lifetime. Keanu felt an odd déjà vu, as if the shoebox in his closet had materialized here in a different shape, carrying another version of his past. "What is it?" Sandra asked. Owen swallowed. "It's from storage. I used to help with fan mail, and anything the studio decided needed to be sorted. They shut down one of the old warehouses this month and sent everything to be destroyed or archived. I was supposed to sign off and let them toss this, but when I opened it..." He pulled back the lid. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, some still pristine, others worn at the corners. Dozens of them. Some addressed to Sandra in different variations, formal, casual, just her first name. Others had no names at all, only that same small lighthouse sketched in one corner. "I thought these were fan letters at first," Owen went on quietly. "But then I started reading the handwriting on the envelopes, and then a few of them weren't sealed properly or they'd torn over time. I saw enough to know these weren't just fan notes. They were personal, carefully written, honest." He looked up at Keanu, meeting his eyes. "And they were all meant for her." Keanu felt his stomach twist. "These are mine," he said hoarsely. I recognized the paper, some of the dates. I must have left them with a production assistant to pass along, and they never made it. I'm afraid they did, Owen said gently. They made it to a locked cabinet I wasn't supposed to open. I was young. I didn't question orders. I was told, anything without a manager's stamp or a return address we can verify goes in here. Safety, they said, privacy, protection from entanglements, so I followed instructions. I filed, I locked, I forgot. On the phone, Sandra's breath caught. You're telling me a studio cabinet has been sitting with years of letters he wrote, and no one thought to what? Ask, deliver them, shred them, anything but let them rot in a warehouse. Owen flinched at the anger in her voice. I'm sorry, he said quickly. I wish I had a better answer. I didn't understand. I was trying to keep my job, and then time went by and another assistant took over and it all just disappeared into the system. I only remembered when I was hauling boxes to be destroyed and saw your name on the top envelope. And the lighthouse. I remembered the lighthouse. Keanu reached for the box with shaking hands and picked up the first letter on the stack. His own handwriting stared back at him, impossibly familiar and stunningly foreign. The date in the upper corner belonged to a year he could barely picture now, a time when he'd been convinced he was already too late. He slid a letter halfway out, just enough to see the opening lines. This one was from the year Sandra had gone through a very public breakup, paparazzi hounding her like vultures. He remembered writing it in the middle of the night, unable to sleep while the world dissected her pain. I know the world thinks it has the right to narrate your life right now, he read aloud softly. But it doesn't. You're more than headlines. I just wanted you to have one voice in the pile that isn't asking for anything. Just reminding you that you are not what they say when the cameras are hungry. You are who you are when no one is looking, and that's the version of you I believe in. His voice faltered. He slid the letter back into its envelope, his chest tight. I never got that, Sandra whispered. I never got any of them, and back then I thought everyone who claimed to care just went quiet when it got complicated. I thought I was alone. The confession hit him harder than any accusation could have. The idea that his silence, forced and accidental as it had been, might have deepened her loneliness carved something open inside him. You weren't alone, he said, his voice rough. You were never alone. I was right here, writing everything I was too scared or too blocked by the system to deliver. There was a long pause. He could hear her steady her breathing, could almost see her pressing a hand to her forehead the way she did when she was trying not to cry. Owen, she said, more composed now, why bring them now after all this time? He shifted in his seat, guilt and determination battling across his face. Because I finally realized that protecting careers, brands, and tidy narratives doesn't mean anything if it costs people the truth they deserved. He turned to Keanu. I saw an interview you did last year. You talked about regret, about how you wished you told people what they meant while they were still here to hear it. It stuck with me. I thought about these letters sitting in the dark because I was too afraid to ask questions when I was younger. I couldn't undo the delay, but I could at least deliver them now, even if it's years late. The room felt small and full all at once, stuffed with envelopes and old choices, with words that had finally found their way home. Keanu ran a hand over his face, overwhelmed by the strange mixture of kindness and damage in what Owen had done and undone. On the line, Sandra's voice was softer. Thank you for finally bringing them, she said. Late truth is still better than comfortable lies. Owen nodded, relief flickering through his guilt. I'll leave you both to it, he said, rising. The rest, that's not my story to carry anymore. He moved toward the door, but Keanu reached out and gripped his shoulder. Hey, he said quietly. You were young, you're here now, that matters. Owen's eyes shone just for a moment. I hope so, he murmured, then slipped out, the door closing gently behind him. Silence settled between them again, but it felt different now. Fuller. Charged. The box sat between Keanu and the phone like a bridge built from all the words that had been stolen by fear and bureaucracy. Are you okay? Sandra asked. No, he answered honestly, but in a good way, I think. He sat back down, pulled the box closer, and lifted another letter. This one had a date from the year she'd won a major award. He remembered the night he wrote it, watching her on TV, eyes bright and tearful, thanking everyone but herself. "Read one," she said suddenly. He paused. "You sure?" "Yes," she replied. "I've spent years not knowing what you were trying to tell me. I don't want to stay in the dark any longer. Pick one. Any year, just let me hear it in your voice." His fingers trembled as he chose an envelope from the middle of the pile. A random year, but maybe not. Maybe the right one had been waiting for this exact moment. He unfolded the letter and began to read, his voice low but steady. "Sandra," he read, "tonight I watched you thank a room full of people and somehow still take none of the credit. You called yourself lucky, like everything you've earned was some cosmic accident. I wish you could see yourself the way the rest of us do, or at least the way I do. You work harder than anyone notices, and you make it look effortless because you never complain. But you're not lucky. You're brave. You're kind in rooms where it's easier to be cold. You show up for people when there's nothing in it for you. That isn't luck, that's character." His eyes burned, but he kept going. "I know you'll probably never read this. Maybe it's better that way. Maybe this is just how I learned to say what I'm too shy to say out loud. But if I could put one thought in your head tonight, it would be this: you are enough. Not because the world claps for you, but because of who you are when the applause stops. And selfishly, I'm grateful I got to see that up close, even for a little while." He stopped, unable to read further. The room blurred at the edges. Across the line, there was only quiet, then a single raw sound he'd never heard from her before. Not movie tears, not prepared emotion, just a real broken breath. "I needed that then," she managed. "I need it now." The confession cut straight through him. For all his fear and hesitation, the words he'd been hiding were exactly the ones she'd been missing. Kindness, given too late, still carried weight, but now it came with the sting of knowing how much it might have helped if it had arrived on time. "Sandra," he said, his voice shaking with something larger than regret. "If I had known, if I'd understood what you were going through all those years, I would have." "You would have done what you always do," she interrupted gently. "You would have showed up quietly without making it about you. That's who you've always been. That's why these letters sound like you. Even when you were hiding, you were still trying to be kind." Her words meant as comfort, felt like both balm and mirror. He saw himself clearly in them, his courage and his cowardice, his loyalty and his distance. He realized that humility, the thing he'd clung to for safety, had sometimes been a shield that kept real connection away. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a moment. "Anything. If I had gotten these letters back then, if they hadn't been locked away, if I'd known what you were really feeling, do you think our lives would have looked different?" The question landed between them with the weight of every missed chance, every almost confession, every red carpet where they'd smiled for the cameras, and then gone home to separate, quiet rooms. Keanu stared at the open box of letters, evidence of a parallel life that might have been. "I don't know," he said honestly, his voice low. "Maybe we would have ruined everything. Maybe we would have found something neither of us was ready for. Or maybe we would have just talked more, shown up sooner, been less alone when it mattered most." He swallowed, then added, "But I do know this. I'm tired of letting fear and forgotten cabinets decide what we're allowed to know about each other." She breathed out slowly, like she'd been waiting years to hear someone say exactly that. "So what do we do now?" she asked. He looked from the letters to the phone, feeling the old caution rise in him and something new pushing against it. Courage, hard-won, late-blooming, but real. "We stop hiding," he said. "No more locked boxes, no more unsent words. I'll bring you these letters, all of them. You should have what was always meant for you. And then, if you're willing, we start again, from the truth this time." There was a long, aching pause. Then softly she said, "Come tomorrow. I don't want to read them alone." He nodded even though she couldn't see him. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "Keanu." "Yeah." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "If these letters say the things I think they might, promise me you won't take them back, not this time, even if it's scary, even if it changes everything." He closed his eyes, feeling the full gravity of what she was asking. It wasn't just about the letters. It was about all of him, the parts that had always stayed safely in the margins. "I promise," he said. They hung up not because they'd run out of words, but because they finally had too many. As the line went silent, Keanu sat alone with the box, tracing the edges of each envelope like they were fragile pieces of a map that might lead them both out of the lives they'd settled for. Tomorrow, he would walk into her world carrying years of unsent honesty. Tomorrow, she would open letters written to the version of herself she no longer was. Between those two realities lay a narrow, trembling hope that it wasn't too late for the truth to build something new. He gathered the letters back into the box, one by one like precious glass, then turned off the lights. In the dark, he lay awake, listening to the sound of his own heartbeat, wondering which would be harder, facing her with everything he'd written, or hearing what she'd finally say in return. Somewhere else in the city, under a different ceiling, Sandra sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the single lighthouse-marked letter she'd found at the studio earlier that day. She read it again and again until the words blurred. Then she whispered into the empty room, as if he could somehow hear her across the miles and the years between them. "You weren't the only one writing letters you never sent." The next morning, when he rang her doorbell with the box in his arms and 1,000 apologies in his eyes, he had no idea that waiting inside, tucked away in a bedside drawer, was a small stack of her own hidden letters addressed to him. Some stories don't reach their climax with music swelling or cameras circling. They arrive quietly on an ordinary morning when two people finally decide they're done hiding. This was one of those mornings. Keanu stood on Sandra's doorstep with the box of letters cradled in his arms like something fragile and irreplaceable. The sky above was overcast, a dull gray that made the world feel softer, more honest. His heart hammered, but his hands were steady. Fear was still there. He could feel it, coiled in his chest, but for once it wasn't in charge. The door opened before he could knock a second time. Sandra stood there in a loose sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a way she never would have worn for cameras. No makeup, no practiced smile, just her. Her eyes went straight to the box, then up to his face, and something in them softened as if she could see every unsent thought he'd ever had. "You came," she said quietly. "I said I would," he replied, equally soft. She stepped aside to let him in. The house smelled like coffee and something faintly floral. Family photos lined the walls, some with people he recognized, some with faces he didn't. This was her real life, the one the world rarely saw. It felt like being invited backstage after watching the same show from the audience for years. They sat at her kitchen table, the box between them. For a long moment neither moved. The weight of everything unsaid thickened the air, but it didn't feel suffocating, not anymore. It felt like the heavy silence before a storm finally breaks and lets the sky breathe. "Do you want coffee?" she asked. He shook his head. "If I start drinking anything right now, I'll spill it on the letters, and that feels symbolic in a way I'm not ready for." She laughed, the sound short but real, and some of the tension cracked. "Okay, no coffee." They both looked down at the box. Sandra rested her fingertips on the lid, then looked up at him again, searching his face. "You're sure?" she asked. "Once we open this, we can't go back to not knowing." "I don't want to go back," he said simply. "We've already lost enough to not knowing." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded, lifted the lid, and set it aside. The letters sat there like a second heartbeat, quiet but insistent. Sandra let out a slow breath, then picked one at random from near the top. Her hands trembled just enough for him to notice, but she didn't hide it. She unfolded the paper carefully, like it might tear if she rushed. "This one's from the year I disappeared for a while," she murmured, scanning the date. "After everything fell apart." He knew which year she meant. A time when she'd gone off the radar, when headlines had turned cruel, when even interviews with him had been laced with questions about her pain. He answered what he could, deflected what he couldn't, and gone home to an empty room where he'd written another letter and buried it instead of mailing it. "Can I read it?" she asked. "It's yours," he said. "All of them are, they always were." She smiled faintly at that, then began to read, silently at first, her eyes moving carefully over his handwriting. He watched as her expression shifted, a small crease of her brow here, a softening around her mouth there. Every tiny change felt like a revelation, like watching someone read a map that led back through years of their own loneliness and realization. After a few minutes, she cleared her throat. "Can I read part of it out loud?" Her voice shook just a little. "I want you to hear what you wrote. I think you need to." He nodded, suddenly too full of emotion to trust his own voice. She lifted the letter and began, her voice low, steadying as she went. "I don't know where you are right now, and I'm not going to ask. You deserve places that aren't followed by cameras. I just want you to know this. Whatever the world is saying, you don't have to be brave for me. You're allowed to fall apart. You're allowed to be angry or quiet or messy or nothing at all. You don't owe us strength. You don't owe anyone a good story out of this pain." Her voice thickened, but she kept going. "If you ever need someone who doesn't need you to be okay for their sake, I'm here. No questions, no cameras, just here. I wish I was braver about saying that out loud. Until then, all I can do is write it down and hope some piece of this love finds you anyway." She stopped, pressing her lips together. Tears shone in her eyes but didn't fall. Not yet. For a moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the distant hum of the fridge and their shared, uneven breathing. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Back then I thought everyone was tired of my drama. I thought you were just being polite when people asked you about me." He shook his head, his chest aching. "I wanted to call 100 times," he said, "but every time I picked up the phone, I told myself you needed space, that I'd be intruding, that my showing up would make it about me." He gave a small, self-mocking smile. "I weaponized my own humility, told myself I was being respectful when really I was just scared. Scared of saying the wrong thing, scared of not being enough to actually help." She looked at him, really looked, and in her eyes he didn't see accusation. She saw through his self-protection the way she always had, stripping it down to something truer. "You know what's wild?" she said softly. "I was doing the same thing." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She set the letter down and pushed her chair back. "Wait here," she said. He watched her disappear down the hallway, heard a drawer open and close, footsteps returning. When she came back, she was holding a small stack of envelopes bound with an old ribbon. The paper was different from his, the handwriting smaller, rounder, but the dates in the corners overlapped his perfectly. "I didn't just find your letter at the studio," she said, coming back to the table. "I found mine, the ones I never sent." She placed them on the table next to his box. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then they both laughed once, softly, at the sheer absurdity of it. Two grown adults, both known for speaking words for a living, unable to send the most important sentences they'd ever written. "You wrote to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than once," she replied. "You weren't the only one who thought stationery was safer than honesty." She slid the stack toward him. "Read one." He picked the top envelope. The date in the corner was from the same year he'd written about watching her win an award and call herself lucky. His fingers trembled as he unfolded it. "Dear Keanu," he read, and his own name in her handwriting hit him like a physical thing. "Tonight the world clapped for me, and I smiled and said all the right things. But when I got back to my hotel room, I realized the person I wanted to talk to most wasn't here." He glanced up at her. Her eyes were fixed on him, steady, waiting. He kept reading. "You have this way of listening without trying to fix everything. You don't rush in with easy answers. You just stand there, and somehow that makes it all feel less heavy. I don't know how to explain it, but when I'm around you, I feel like I'm allowed to be just a person. Not Sandra Bullock, not a headline, not a product, just me." His voice wavered. He swallowed and continued. "Sometimes I wish I were braver. I wish I could tell you how much your kindness means to me without sounding ridiculous. I wish I could say that when I think about the people I trust, really trust, you're always there in that tiny, sacred circle. But I'm scared that if I say more, I'll break the quiet, easy thing we have and you'll pull away. So I keep it here on paper instead of risking losing you." He stopped, unable to read further. The words blurred on the page. It was like listening to an echo of his own fear, spoken in her voice instead of his. "You felt that way," he managed. She nodded, her jaw tight with emotion. "I still do, if I'm honest. Back then, every time an interviewer tried to turn our friendship into a headline, I pushed back hard. Not because there wasn't anything there, but because it felt like this fragile, beautiful thing I didn't trust the world with. I thought if I kept it quiet, I could keep it safe. And somewhere in trying to protect it, I stopped actually living it." He set the letter down carefully. "We were both protecting something that never got a chance to exist," he said. Kindness, courage, all the things we thought we valued, we used them as reasons not to act. Cowardice dressed as humility, she said with a small, sad smile. We're a pair, aren't we? They both laughed again, but there was no bitterness in it now. Just recognition, and underneath it, a shared grief for the years spent circling each other in silence. For a while, they took turns reading excerpts from their letters, times when he'd written about her generosity on set, and she'd written about his quiet strength after personal tragedy. Moments when he'd predicted she was stronger than she knew, and she'd written that he didn't realize how much light he brought into the rooms he thought he haunted. The theme was unmistakable. For years, they had both seen the best in each other while doubting the best in themselves. They had both offered compassion while refusing to accept it. Their kindness had been loudest when it was aimed outward. Their courage had always stopped at their own skin. Eventually, the letters grew too heavy to keep reading. They let them rest on the table like open wounds finally exposed to air. So, Sandra said quietly, breaking the silence, what do we do with all of this? With the letters, with the almosts, with the fact that we somehow managed to miss each other while writing to each other the whole time? He thought about it, really thought, instead of reaching for a deflection or a joke. We don't try to rewrite the past, he said slowly. We let it be what it was, two scared people doing the best they could with what they knew then, and then we decide what to do with what we know now. And what do we know now? She asked, her voice soft but steady. That we cared, he said. That we still care. That the connection we were afraid to name didn't disappear just because we ignored it. It adapted. It survived. And it deserves better than being tucked away in boxes and drawers. She studied him, a dozen emotions flickering across her face. Are you saying you? She trailed off, searching for a word big enough and gentle enough at the same time. I'm saying I've loved you in some form or another for a very long time, he said, the words landing with a quiet certainty that surprised even him. Sometimes as a friend, sometimes as something I didn't have the courage to look at too closely, but it never went away. It just got quieter, quieter than it deserved. Her eyes filled, and this time the tears fell. She didn't wipe them away right away. She let them trace the truth of his words down her cheeks. You know, she said, a shaky smile forming, I spent years wondering if I was crazy for feeling like there was more between us than what we ever said out loud. I kept telling myself I'd invented it, that I was reading into kindness because I wanted to believe in something that wasn't there. She paused, then added softly, it's a strange kind of relief to find out I wasn't imagining it, that I wasn't alone in that either. He reached across the table slowly, giving her time to pull back if she needed to. She didn't. Her hand met his halfway, fingers lacing through his in a way that felt at once new and deeply, inexplicably familiar. I can't promise I won't be scared, he said. I can't promise we won't mess this up sometimes, but I can promise something else. I'm done hiding. I'm done assuming silence will protect what I care about. You deserve better than unsent letters. We both do. She squeezed his hand. Then let's be scared together, she said. Let's figure it out in the open where it's supposed to be. No more ghost versions of us writing to each other from separate rooms. They sat like that for a long moment, the letters surrounding them like witnesses and blessings all at once. The past didn't suddenly become easier, but it did become lighter. Named, faced, transformed from a weight into a foundation. Eventually, she stood and moved around the table to sit beside him, not across from him. Their shoulders brushed, and neither pulled away. She picked up one of his letters and one of hers, set them side by side on the table, and studied them. You know, she said, a hint of mischief threading through the tenderness, if anyone ever reads these, they're going to think we were characters in some impossibly dramatic romance novel. He laughed, the sound breaking free from deep in his chest. Maybe, he said. Or maybe they'll just see two flawed people trying really hard to be kind and brave and not always getting it right. Maybe, she echoed. Then her expression shifted, more serious again. But if they see anything, I hope they see this, that it's never too late to say what should have been said years ago. That humility doesn't have to mean silence. That courage can look like showing up with a box of old letters and saying, this is me. This is what I've been afraid of. Can you still meet me here? He turned to her, his gaze steady. Can you, he asked quietly. Meet me here, not in the past, not in the what-ifs, just here now. She looked at him for a long, unbroken moment, the kind of moment that rewires something fundamental between two people. Then she nodded, slow and deliberate. I already have, she said. Outside, the sky finally opened, rain tapping softly against the windows like a gentle applause no one else could hear. Inside, they sat together at the table, not trying to rush the moment into some cinematic end. There was no grand kiss, no orchestrated declaration for the cameras. Just two people holding hands, reading and rereading the words they'd been too afraid to send, and choosing, at last, to live the story they'd only ever written about. In the years that followed, those letters would become more than a secret history. They would be reminders, folded, faded proof, that kindness matters even when it's late, that courage can arrive years behind schedule and still be right on time. That resilience isn't always about surviving the worst things, but about finally stepping toward the best things you were too afraid to claim. And somewhere in a quiet drawer in that same kitchen, two new letters would rest side by side, written on the same day, in the same room, with no fear this time. Not sealed, not hidden, not waiting for courage. Just there, open and honest, like the two people who finally understood that the bravest love stories aren't the ones that start perfectly. They're the ones that almost never started at all, and somehow still did.